Hey there, crewmates. Gabe from Nexus Core here with another deck profile. So, if you saw recently, I uploaded a video going over the tournament results over a recent large scale tournament with about 150 participants. If you saw that video, you would know that in the top 16, there were four of the top 16 was taken place by mono green kid decks, making it the most represented within top 16 and likely the tournament as a whole. So because of that, I decided to make my own because I wanted to hop on the meta deck bandwagon. So I have made my own list here. I've looked over a lot of the topping lists that we saw, made my own swaps to some of them, and I'm actually quite happy with what this is. I don't think there's really anything I would change because it is mono green and we really only have the one set. So because of that, I'm actually quite happy with how it turned out. Maybe minor tweaks, but for now, let's just get into it. So first, the leader we're going with is Eustass Kid, who is from the start deck. His effect is once per turn. You can pay 3 to discard a card to switch the leader to active. So he's good for multi-attack. If it's the late game and you want to push, shove 7 Dawn underneath him, make him a 12k hitter, attack for 12, uses effect to restand and attack for 12 twice. If your opponent's at 0 life and they don't have any blockers, they are probably screwed. Now, we're running Kid as the leader because I don't think, at least as of now, there are enough red cards to justify a green-red version of this list. The deck is quite tight as it is, and there are, of course, some solid red cards, but I don't think it's really worth running a lot of them for having one less life. This is a deck that definitely thrives in a long, drawn out game just because of how bulky and defensive it is, as we'll get into. So because of that, I prioritize the 5 life. And because there's also a lot of pretty quick aggro decks like Zoro, there are aggro variants of Red Green Law and Red Green Luffy. So being able to have the extra life against very quick and aggressive decks is definitely more beneficial. I do usually use Kid's effect at least once, but more than anything, it's because he's a 5 life leader. And in this deck, there is only one card with the Wano Country attribute, so there's no reason really to run Odin. There are Odin variants of Kid Tower Defense, and I might experiment with those, but I prefer the Supernova dedicated build. And yeah, there's not really anything I would like to change, and I feel as though making it part Supernova, part Wano would make it a bit too cramped for my own tastes. So moving on, normally I want to go into low to high cost, but because of how integral Eustass Captain Kid the SR is, I'm going to start off with him because the whole deck is quite literally built around him. So if you don't know, what Kid does is he's an 8/8, and for one Dawn, while one Dawn is attached to him, during your opponent's turn, if Kid is rested, your opponents can only attack characters named Kid. So this would apply technically if you had another copy of Kid that isn't this, like the promo one, but basically it forces all of the attacks to redirect to him. Your opponent can't attack leaders or problematic cards or whatever. So having that effect on an 8k body is just super good. And additionally, just to make it go by even faster, you can rest this character to play a character with 3 or less cost from your hand. So beyond all of that, you can just cheat out a guy and have fun with that. Now, what's nice about this is because of both of these effects, he is theoretically playable turn 4 by being an 8 cost. So, or it would be turn 4 if you're going second, turn 5 if you're going first. But because you have the initiative, it kind of makes up for it. What's nice about this is if you really don't think you can protect him, but you're not worried that you're going to lose on the following turn, you can just play Kid and have him out on the board. At this point in the game, the only card that can outright kill Kid is the board wipe Kaido, who of course costs 10 Dawn. Everything else that can get rid of Kid, like you would have in blue with Mihawk or the Crocodile Leader or the Crocodile Blocker, I believe, usually targets 5 or less, 7 at the most, and Kid just skates by. Kid isn't even targetable by the 9-drop start deck Kaido, so really, unless you are playing specifically the 10-drop Kaido in a purple deck, there is just it is so hard to answer Kid, and keeping him alive is the name of the game. Most of the list we have seen up until the tournament that we just saw, we're really only running two or three. That's primarily because Kid, uh, this deck, as you can see, does have a decently high curve, and you really don't want to see two or three Kids in your opening hand. But at the same time, Kid is so integral to the deck, and getting him on board and keeping him there is so impactful on its own that I think running four is actually a very solid choice because it guarantees you being able to see it. The deck does have decent backup plans with multi-attack and restanding characters, but the bulk of what this deck wants to do is get Kid out and keep him alive. So being able to do that, I think, is the most impactful, and being able to run him at 4 means you don't even necessarily need to find him off of Bonnie, so your odds of seeing what the deck's centered around increases by that much. So I do think going forward, while a lot of people experimented with 2 or 3, I think 4 might actually be the correct answer. So next, we're of course running the SR Law, who's a 5/6 blocker with on place. Return any character from field to hand to play a character with cost 3 or less. It's a 6k blocker, so it can block most things. If your opponent really hates Kid and is running Shanks, Law can still block that. It's a 6k blocker, which is already great on its own, and the ability to reuse on place effects or to cheat out one drops and play one drops and then cheat out 2 or 3s, or at least protect the ones, like if you're playing Bonnie, I think is very important. So Law is also an easy 4-up. Next, we are running 4 copies of the other start deck, Trafalgar Law, who's a 5/6 with counter +1, who's on play switch arrested character that's a Supernova or Heart Pirate with cost 5 or less to active. So that, again, this is another means of multi-attack. I like this. I think this Kid, Law is good, and it's decent backup plan if you don't see Kid. This is the one that's likely going to get cut out in the relatively near future, largely because, again, the name of the game is keep Kid alive. If I did go into red-green, I'd probably just run a blocker over it, because for the on-play to restand something with decent stats is definitely a solid play, but this isn't what the deck is really going for, and it really is a backup plan, and you're only going to really use it after you get Kids situated or if you have nothing else to do. And while 5 isn't the worst for a restanding attack, because you're going to be you're spending 5 to play this Law, you can't put a whole lot of Dawn on what you want to restand, and also the Kid leader himself does the restanding. So at the end of the day, this is good, especially because he still has counter on top of a solid effect, but this is the one that I'm not the biggest in love with. If anything, attacking with this SR Law and then restanding him with the start deck one, so you can either get 2 attacks with a 6k or attack with a 6k and keep the blocker, makes it pretty good. So I do very much enjoy Law. It's just once the game keeps going forward and we get either a bunch more promos or the second booster pack in a couple of months, then I think this Law might be on the cutting room floor just for that reason. Next, we're running 4 copies of the start deck Basil Hawkins. This one can have varying degrees of how much you run. I am running it at 4 because, at least based off of the tournament results that we saw, Kid is arguably the best deck in the format and will likely be that way for a decent while, and if nothing else, he will be a contender in the meta. So Basil is for anti-Kid. So Basil, for those who don't know, is a 5/6 for Dawn 1 once per turn. During your turn, if it battles an opponent's character, you can set this card to active. So what really makes this good is because he has the 6 base and he needs 1 Dawn anyways, that makes him a 7. You put the second Dawn underneath it, so for only 2 Dawn, you have an 8k, which means it threatens Kid. But because of the wording, even if your opponent blocks this, because it's still technically battled a character, it will still restand. So effectively, you pay the 5 Dawn and give Hawkins 2 on one of your turns. This card can force at least 2 cards out of your opponent who wants to protect Kid, which is very, very good in the Kid mirror. But what's also nice is it isn't even a bad card. These are solid stats, and again, the meta does include in large part cards like Zoro Rush. You got Red Green Law, who runs a lot of low cost attackers, and it doesn't need to battle a character of a specific cost or power, like some other restrictions we see. It just needs to battle the character. So any deck that likes to run a lot of characters can really mess with their momentum. Red doesn't have a lot of a whole bunch of drawing, so being able to just hit their attackers means they can't have as much of an aggro game. Red Green Law wants to have 5 characters, so hitting those means it's harder for him to use the effect. And what's really nice about this is because it just needs to battle the opponent's character, if your opponent is at 0 life or at 1 and you have 2 Hawkins, for example, and your opponent wants to block, even if they block Hawkins, Hawkins will still restand. So this is also, to some extent, it's great because when it attacks the character, it restands, but by virtue of that wording, it also pseudo acts as unblockable, because while it can technically be blocked, it will restand, so your opponent will need 2 blockers to actually stop Hawkins. So this is quite good, and it's very good if your opponent is running low on life or is just playing a very character heavy deck. And from what we've seen, that seems to be what a lot of people are doing, so I do actually like running Hawkins at 4. And at the end of the day, it's also a restander for free, so even if your opponent only has 1 character, you can effectively just kill it for free once Hawkins is there, because it's attacking for 7k, and you don't lose anything by attacking a character with Hawkins. So I actually do have come to very much enjoy Hawkins in this deck, and it's just great in the mirror match. Next, we are running 4 copies of the start deck Diaz Drake, who is a 4/5 with counter 1. 1 Dawn during your turn. While he is rested, your leader and your characters with Marines or the Supernova type gain 1,000 power. What's nice about this wording is that it does count itself, so because it has the Dawn underneath, it is at least going to be a 7k. Give it 2 Dawn, much like the Hawkins example, and it threatens Kid. And it also makes other things more threatening to Kid. If you got Drake and Hawkins, it becomes a lot easier to actually take down Kid, because you give 1 Dawn, you give 2 Dawn, you still need to give 2 Dawn to Drake and 1 to Hawkins, but that's for a 3 Dawn during your turn while the characters are there. You can threaten Kid, and then just use the rest of your Dawn to either continue threatening or fortify your defenses. So I do like Drake in this deck, but it's kind of in the same category as Law, where I think it's solid and fine. I just don't know if it will be here once we start getting more cards. Next, we are running the start deck Killer, who's a 3/3 with 1, who's on play, KO an opponent's rested character with a cost of 3 or less, and trigger, you can play this card. Very good against most matchups. This is great against most non-Kid decks because, again, as I said, red aggro and green-red Law and Luffy do like to run a lot of low-to-the-ground characters. This deck, as we'll go into soon, has some means of resting an opponent's character, so you can use this proactively against a blocker if you really want to. And because of its cost, it is recyclable with the SR Law, so the usual combo as it goes is if you're playing against a heavy aggro with low to the cost deck, you play Killer, pop something, play Law, bounce Killer, play Killer again, pop something else. So I do like Kid, and it having the trigger really is just gravy. Next, we are running the only non-Supernova and the card from Wano, who is Izo, who's a 3/3 with counter 2, who's on place is rest an opponent's character with 4 or less. This is quite nice. A lot of why you run it is the counter 2000. It's a very, very hefty defense, especially when you have Kid to give. Izo alone makes Kid a 10k. And beyond that, you can use it proactively too. If you're in the Kid mirror or if you're playing against any deck with a decent amount of blockers, you can play Izo, rest a blocker, and then just beat face. Because most blockers are 4 or less. There are, of course, the exceptions like Law and Queen, but in those cases, you can also just keep Izo in your hand. And if anything, you can play Izo to rest something that's problematic while it's standing, and then do the Law combo and play Killer to get rid of it. So Izo's quite good. Love that he has the 2000 counter, so Izo is definitely a great spot in this deck. Would have loved it if a Supernova had the exact same stat line in effect, so it could be searchable off of Bonnie, but what are you gonna do? Next is Scratchman Apu, who's a 2/3 with counter 2, Dawn 1 when attacking rest an opponent's Dawn card. Not bad. You are running it because it has counter 2000, and that is actually reason enough in a lot of cases, especially because we have a couple of blockers that don't have any counter, so you do prioritize the counter number. This is another one that will likely be replaced once we get in the next set, hopefully another Supernova with 2000 shield, because I think the fact that he is searchable off of Bonnie for defense is good, and it's not that bad by any means. Like, resting a Dawn isn't bad, but you really do run him for his stats as opposed to an effect, and that's really all there is to say. The fact that he needs one Dawn to rest, but two Dawn to actually hit a leader does kind of leave a lot to be desired. Next, we are running the Romance Dawn Killer, who is a 2/2 with counter 1, who's a blocker, Dawn 1 on block. If you have 3 or more characters, draw a card. So, again, because you're running Kid, you're going to at least have one character on the board when your opponent attacks, because while this deck does have a decently high curve with a couple of 4+, as you can see, it does have quite a few 3 or less, so being able to get 3 on the board is definitely not the hardest thing in the world, especially for one Dawn to get a draw off of it, and because it's cost 3 or less, even if you can't get the draw based on what your Dawn is at, you can at least cheat him out with the 8-drop Kid just to have a free blocker. And the fact that he also has counter 1000 does not hurt either, and it can also potentially get you a draw, so Killer's great. Next, the obvious one is going to be 4 copies of Capone Gang Beige. It's a Supernova, 1/1 with blocker. It's a 1-drop blocker that's searchable by Bonnie, so if you have Kid, Killer, and Beige while you have 10 Dawn, you spend 8 to play Kid, give Kid one of your Dawn, tap it to play Killer, use your 10th Dawn to play Beige. Congrats, you got Kid rested and have 2 blockers. So it's a low-to-the-ground Supernova blocker. That is all he needs to be. And lastly, for the characters, the other obvious one is Jewelry Bonnie, 1/1 with counter 1. Active during the main phase, you can pay 1 to rest this card, check top 5 for any Supernova card, not just character, add it to your hand, and place the rest on the bottom. She adds herself. The only cards she doesn't add are the 4 copies of Ezo and the 2 events we're about to get into, so she's not gonna whiff. If Jewelry Bonnie whiffs with this specific list, that is the RNG gods telling you you're not meant to win this game. So Jewelry Bonnie is so good in this deck. She searches your copy of Kid, so it makes seeing Kid even more consistent, so you have an effective 8 copies of it in the deck, because 4 of the base, 4 of the searcher, so adding that consistency of Kid on board is great, and because of how many defensive options we have, it's quite easy to both keep Kid on deck and potentially get a second one out. If you have 2 Kids, your opponent is going to start crying. And lastly, onto the events, we're only running 2 copies of Paradise Waterfall. It is a 1 where your leader gets 2000, and you can set a character to active. The reason I'm not in love with this is because the primary combo you use it for is to block with, say, Law, and then restand it with Waterfall, because that's an 8k block. But at the same time, Kid is already an 8k, so if Kid's on board, you can't really do that because you're going to have to protect a lot anyways. And if Kid is not on board, you're going to want to get him on board. And so the best use for Waterfall I've found is either attacking with Law, and if you don't have the other Law, when you are starting to defend on your opponent's turn, while Law will be rested, you can give 2k from Waterfall to Kid and then stand Law to block with him, because at the end of the day, it's an additional version of counter plus 2000 for an 8k, so being able to make him a 10k is pretty much good enough on its own. And as I said, playing Kid using his cheat out effect and giving him Dawn costs 9, so Waterfall being a 1 means you can still have that Dawn left up to keep him up. I'm only running it at 2, really just because it's a 2000, and the restand, it does have niche applications that I like. Hopefully we start getting something that is another 1-drop Supernova event that's pretty much in the same tier, because I just want to make it searchable off of Bonnie. And the very last card is going to be Punk Gibson, a phenomenal event card, who for 2 cost, you can give your leader or a character 4,000 power, and then rest a character with a cost of 4 or less, or its trigger effect is rest any of your opponent's characters regardless of its cost. So what's wonderful about this is the real only asterisk to this card is because Kid costs 8, and if you wanted to rest him the turn you played him and give him the Dawn, you are going to you won't be able to use Punk Gibson. However, provided you are able to keep Kid alive for that first turn, being able to use Punk Gibson becomes phenomenal. It turns Kid into a 12k, which most things are not gonna hit. Your opponent is going to have to dump so many resources in when you will still likely have a blocker, as we still have 4, 8, 12 blockers, and if you really needed to, you have plenty of cards with counter to really stick at home. Being able to rest characters of cost 4 or less is fantastic in the low to the ground rush meta that we currently have, and the trigger effect is not even that bad. If you took damage and really just need to survive, you can rest anything of any size, which is very cool. So if for whatever reason you're in the mirror and your opponent didn't attack with their Kid, and you're threatened by that 9k that will likely have, you can rest it. And while it will be a Kid rested, it was going to be rested anyways because it's Kid. So you can at least defend yourself from a very big number. And being able to turn Kid into 12 and being able to turn Kid the leader into 9 while resting another potential attacker or blocker, if you want to be proactive for your upcoming turn, makes Punk Gibson just an absolutely incredible addition to this deck, and it's a Supernova, so Bonnie can search it. I'm having a lot of fun with this deck, if I'm being honest. For the sake of complete transparency, this isn't the most fun deck that I have built. I think I do prefer the red-green Law deck a little bit more because of how fun the combos are. This deck is a bit linear, I would say, if you don't like your linear decks, but it is very potent, and I like winning. I'll be flat out with that. I do like playing a nice, strong meta deck, and so that's good enough for me. And I also do enjoy a nice defensive deck where you can really wall up and just slowly grind your opponent out, and this deck really excels at that. The only way you can affect get rid of Kid is via, again, Kaido, and a lot of decks, and part of why I did forget to mention this when I was talking about Kid, is part of why I'm running it at 4, is as the power of Kid is becoming a known quantity in the meta, more people are going to be boarding into going against it. As you saw if you watched my red-green list, I am running Otama, and I have made minor changes, and I think I and a lot of other players that are at least in red are going to be running a Round Table, which is the red card that is a Supernova, so it's searchable if you're in red-green thanks to Bonnie, but if you're in mono-red, it's still a 4-cost, give a character minus 10,000, so even like a 1k attacker could threaten Kid in that case. So I think, again, as I forgot to mention, running Kid at 4 is great because as people are running more and more answers to Kid, having more and more Kids beyond consistency is good to effectively answer the answers. But I think I do enjoy how the Kids play style. I just wish there was a bit more of, I guess, direct card advantage. The only real ways you have of gaining cards is via Bonnie and the blocking with Killer, and I love that, but I am somebody who likes resources. This is a deck that really gets its resources by not really getting them, but by keeping your main thing up, and your opponent has to spend so much more to take it down than you do to keep it up, and you just grind your opponent down by attacking with a 9k repeatedly. So I do like this deck. The restanding is nice, and as we get either more restanding and more blocking, I think it will be a bit more fun. This is a fun deck to pilot if you like if you like something that's nice and defensive. Does suit my play style, but I just wish there was a bit more, like fun little interactions you could have beyond just the blocking and activating with Waterfall. But if you know from me from my Vanguard channel, I'm somebody that does enjoy restanding, so having things like the start deck Law, Hawkins, Kid as a leader is fun. The main way games are cleaned up is your opponent just cannot answer the SR Kid. You hit them for 9, and as I said when I was talking about the leader, you just shove a bunch of Dawn under him and multi-attack. That will usually clinch most games. But this deck is very, very powerful, and I'm very happy with how it performed. I did have two matches recently, and it's only two, and it's all anecdotal evidence from a non-tournament setting, so take that with a grain of salt. But because of how my hand shaped up and what I was playing against, I was at 0 life when my opponent was still at 4 or 5, but because of how bulky Kid is, I still managed to turn it around and win because Kid beats face. Kid is hard, if not basically impossible to take down. If your opponent doesn't take down Kid the turn you play him when you have 10 or 9 Dawn rested, it becomes much more challenging just because you can start playing blockers from hand or start using your defensive events. And then also, obviously, you just have a 9k beater from then on. So this deck is quite interesting. I, based on what we have right now, I don't really know what changes I would make. I might experiment with a 7-drop start deck Kid, but I think that just messes with the curve too much because we are running 8 Kids anyways. And I don't really know what else there would be beyond just experimenting with a completely different build by going the Wano route just to try out Odin and Kid. But in terms of a Supernova Kid turbo deck, I think this really is probably about where it should be sitting at, more or less, save some minor tweaks catered to personal preference for how the meta shapes up. But I think everything looks good. Everything advances your game state or answers things that don't. Kid is your game state and also answers the Kid matchup because they just punch each other to death. Law advances your game state by blocking, but also you can do some fun on-play shenanigans with cards like Ezo and Killer. Law is your default if you don't see Kid, just multi-attack. Basil answers Kid, mono red Zoro, red green both Law and Luffy, and and a lot of other decks. By virtue of it being a 7k, once you give it the Dawn, it can even rival things in purple if you're playing Kaido, so that's solid enough for itself. You got Drake, who again is your backup in the same vein as Law, just to power things up, but by virtue of it also being a 7k, it hits numbers that can rival purple and rival Kid in the mirror. Killer is just effect destruction, which is always good, and it also works against most things in the meta. If your opponent has Bonnie, hit it early. If your opponent is playing a Wano variant, hit something like Raizo or what they would want to restand with Kinemon. If they're playing anything in red, they're going to have low to the ground attackers. Ezo for 2 shield to answer anything that wants to answer it, but also stopping blockers if you really need to hit something. 2k shield is an advancement of your game state onto itself. Advancement of your game state and blocker that can be cheated out with the 8-drop Kid. Same as I said, cheatable with Kid and low to the cost so to be played. Bonnie is searching, and these are just strong defensive options. So I've repeated this enough. I know I like to ramble on, but this deck I think is for the most part complete and will probably have less changes once we are able to start playing in paper once this set comes out, as opposed to the other two lists on my channel. I am already tweaking those in videos I've uploaded after because of how many things you can do with this game. So be on the lookout for whenever I upload those videos. So that is going to wrap it up. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy. Let me know what you think about the Kid deck. Do you hate how hard it is to out him? How much hate do you run just to out him? Or if you also play the Kid deck, do you like pissing people off with an unstoppable wall? Thank you all again, and I will see you in the next video.